Once worshipped as a god, now starving to death in the dark, his stomach twists with hunger. His body grows weaker each day. He could once command life or death with a single word. Now he's alone, starving, forgotten, waiting for a meal that will never come. This is King Richard II of England, a child crowned before he even understood the weight of a crown. People praise him as a savior, a miracle of royal blood, but behind those royal smiles stood a lonely boy who could trust no one. Then came Queen Anne, his light in a cold and faithless world. With her, he found peace. For a while, England had a gentle king who dreamed of beauty and harmony. But fate was cruel. Anne died, and it shattered Richard forever. The dreamer vanished, replaced by a tyrant who ruled through fear. Every insult, every betrayal, he repaid with blood. Yet in the end, his own cousin destroyed him. A king who tried to grab absolute power ended up alone in a dark cell, slowly dying from hunger. Was he a monster, or just a broken boy who never stood a chance? Before we uncover this tragic history, please like this video. It really helps the channel, and share it with other history lovers like you.
January 6th, 1367. A baby cries in the Archbishop's palace in Bordeaux, France. His name is Richard. His father is Edward, the Black Prince, the greatest warrior in England. His grandfather is King Edward III, ruler of England and much of France. Richard was born into royalty, born into war, born into a world that will ask too much of him. But Richard doesn't know this yet. He's just a baby. His father, the Black Prince, earned his name from the black armor he wore into battle. He fought in the 100 Years' War. He won great victories for England. He was a hero. People loved him. They expected his son to be just like him. Richard had an older brother named Edward. Edward was born 3 years before Richard. He was the one who would someday be king. Richard was just the spare, the backup. He could live a quiet life. But fate had other plans. When Richard was only 3 years old, his brother got sick. The bubonic plague swept through Europe like a dark wind. It killed millions, rich and poor, young and old. No one was safe. In late 1370, Edward, the older brother, the heir, died from the plague. Suddenly, Richard mattered. He was next in line now, second only to his father. But his father was sick too. The Black Prince had fallen ill years earlier during a campaign in Spain. Some thought he'd been poisoned. Others said it was dysentery. Whatever it was, he never recovered. He grew weaker every year. Richard was just a small boy watching the two most important men in his life fade away. In June 1376, the Black Prince died. Richard was 9 years old. His grandfather, King Edward III, was old and frail. Everyone knew he didn't have much time left. So Parliament gathered. They made Richard the Prince of Wales. They declared him the next king. Richard was a child, but the crown was coming for him whether he wanted it or not. 1 year later, on June 21st, 1377, King Edward III died. Richard was 10 years old, and now he was King of England. A child suddenly burdened with the fate of England. But Richard couldn't rule alone. He was too young. So a council was formed. Old men, nobles, advisors, his uncles. They would make the real decisions. Richard would just sit on the throne and look like a king. His most powerful uncle was John of Gaunt. John was born in Ghent in the Low Countries. People mispronounced the name and it became Gaunt. He was Edward III's oldest surviving son. He had fought in wars. He knew how power worked. And now, with Richard so young, John had more influence than anyone else. Another uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, also watched closely. These men wanted to guide Richard or control him. It's hard to say. Richard was crowned at Westminster Abbey on July 16, 1377. The ceremony was grand. People cheered. There was hope in the air. England had been struggling under Edward III's final years. The war with France was going badly. Taxes were too high. People were angry. Maybe this boy king would bring a fresh start. But hope fades quickly. The council kept raising taxes to pay for the war. The common people suffered, hungry and angry. And Richard, still just a child, could only watch. He saw it all, but he couldn't stop what was happening around him. England was crumbling, and Richard was learning a hard lesson. No one was really on his side.
By 1381, Richard was 14, still young, still learning how to be a king. But England wasn't waiting for him to grow up. The taxes grew heavier. The council introduced a new tax called the poll tax. At first, only the wealthy paid it, but then they expanded it. Now everyone had to pay, even the poorest farmers, even people who could barely afford food. The people were furious. Around the same time, a man named John Wycliffe was preaching dangerous ideas. He was a priest and a scholar. He taught at Oxford. He believed the church was too rich, too corrupt. He said priests should be poor. He said the Pope in Rome had too much power. He even questioned whether Jesus was truly present in the bread and wine at Mass. These were shocking ideas. Heresy, the church called it. But people listened, especially the poor. Wycliffe's ideas gave them hope. Maybe the world didn't have to be the way it was. Maybe the rich didn't deserve all their wealth. Maybe the poor deserved better. And then, in the summer of 1381, everything exploded. It started in Kent and Essex. Thousands of peasants gathered. They were armed with farming tools, axes, hammers, anything they could find. They marched toward London. Their leaders were Wat Tyler, a tradesman, and John Ball, a preacher who echoed Wycliffe's beliefs. They wanted change. They wanted the poll tax gone. They wanted freedom from serfdom, the system that kept them tied to the land like property. The rebellion grew fast. By the time the peasant army reached Blackheath, just outside London, there were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Richard's council members panicked. The peasants didn't stop at Blackheath. They entered London. They burned buildings. They broke into prisons and freed prisoners. They hunted down the men they blamed for their suffering. They found Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They dragged him out and beheaded him. They did the same to Robert Hales, the Lord High Treasurer. They burned down John of Gaunt's palace, the Savoy. It was one of the most beautiful buildings in England. Now it was ash. London was in chaos, and Richard was trapped in the Tower of London, the fortress at the heart of the city. His advisors didn't know what to do. Fight? Negotiate? Run? Richard was only 14. What could he possibly do? But then, Richard surprised everyone. He agreed to meet the rebels, face to face. On June 14th, Richard rode out to Mile End, east of London. Thousands of peasants waited there. Wat Tyler led them. Richard promised to listen. He told them he would end serfdom. He told them he would remove the poll tax. He told them what they wanted to hear. Some of the peasants believed Richard's promises and began returning home, but not all of them. The next day, Richard met Wat Tyler again at Smithfield. This meeting went terribly wrong. Tyler spoke boldly, too boldly for those around the king. Some said he was rude, even defiant. Voices rose. In the chaos, someone drew a weapon. William Walsworth, the Lord Mayor of London, struck Tyler with his sword. Tyler fell to the ground. He died right there. For a moment, everything stopped. The peasants stared at their dead leader. They looked at Richard. They outnumbered the king's men by hundreds, maybe thousands. They could rush forward. They could kill the king. Richard did something bold. He rode forward, alone, straight toward the angry crowd. "I am your king," he said. "I will be your leader. Follow me." The peasants hesitated. Then, slowly, they began to disperse. They believed him. They thought he would keep his promises. He didn't. Once the rebellion lost its momentum, Richard's government crushed what was left. They hunted down the remaining leaders. They executed them. And all those promises Richard made, he took them back. He said he had no choice. He said he was forced to make those promises. The rebellion was over.
But something changed in Richard that summer. He had faced thousands of angry rebels and won. He learned that words could be stronger than swords, and that people would believe him if he spoke with confidence. He learned he could manage things himself. He didn't need advisors. He didn't need his uncles. He was the king, the chosen one, and he could do anything. Make promises, break them. It didn't matter as long as he stayed in control. He was only 14, but already he had learned how power truly worked.
Richard grew older. He wanted to rule on his own. He was tired of the council, tired of his uncles telling him what to do. He was the king. Why couldn't he act like one? So he surrounded himself with men he trusted, or at least men he thought he could trust. Michael de la Pole became one of his closest advisors. Richard made him Lord Chancellor in 1383. 2 years later, Richard gave him the title of Earl of Suffolk. Another favorite was his childhood friend, Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Richard and Robert were close. Some say too close. Rumors spread, but Richard didn't care. These were his friends, his people. The nobles, however, hated them. They thought de la Pole and de Vere had too much influence. They thought they were leading Richard astray, and they blamed them for the war with France going so badly, because the war was a disaster. England had once been winning. Under Edward III, English armies had marched deep into France. They'd won great battles. But now the French were pushing back. They reclaimed almost everything England had taken. English forces were stuck in a few port towns, barely holding on. The nobles wanted action. They wanted a big campaign. They wanted glory like the old days. But that required money, a lot of money, and Richard's government didn't have it. In 1386, Parliament met. It was called the Wonderful Parliament. Michael de la Pole stood before them and asked for more taxes, heavy taxes. Parliament said no, not unless Richard agreed to let them oversee how he spent the money. They wanted control. They wanted to make sure the money went to the war, not into the pockets of Richard's favorites. Richard was furious. He refused at first, but he had no choice. Without taxes, he couldn't defend the kingdom, so he agreed, reluctantly. But Richard didn't forget. He never forgot. In February 1387, Richard left London. He spent 8 months traveling around England, building support. He placed loyal men in powerful positions. He got a legal ruling from his Chief Justice, Robert Tresilian, saying that Parliament had broken the law. Richard was preparing for war, not with France, with his own powerful aristocrats. He returned to London in November, but the nobles were waiting for him. Led by his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, now the Duke of Gloucester, they confronted the king. They accused Richard's friends of treason: de la Pole, de Vere, Tresilian. Richard tried to stall, but then more nobles joined Gloucester. They called themselves the Lords Appellant. One of them was Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. Henry was Richard's cousin. They'd grown up together. But now Henry stood against him. Richard had no choice. His friends fled. De la Pole and de Vere escaped to the continent. They were sentenced to death in their absence. Tresilian wasn't so lucky. He was caught. He was executed. In 1387, Parliament met again. They called it the Merciless Parliament. Richard sat on his throne and watched as his friends were condemned, executed, destroyed. He was 21 years old. He was king, but he had no power. And yet, Richard didn't break. He stayed calm. He played the game. He pretended to accept what happened. He said he'd been poorly advised. He said he would do better. It was all a lie. Deep inside, Richard was burning. He remembered every face, every name, every betrayal. But he waited, because that's what you do when you have no power. You wait for your moment.
In May 1389, Richard turned 22. He declared that his minority was over. He would rule on his own now, fully, completely. The nobles didn't argue. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they realized they couldn't do any better than Richard had. After all, they'd promised to win the war. But when they tried, they found the same problem Richard had faced. There was no money. So in 1389, England and France signed a truce, the Truce of Walsingham. 3 years of peace, everyone could breathe. Around the same time, John of Gaunt returned from Spain. He'd been gone for 3 years, chasing his claim to the throne of Castile. Now he was back, and surprisingly, he became a stabilizing force. He helped bridge the gap between Richard and the nobles who had opposed him. For the first time in years, England was calm. And Richard? He finally had space to live. He'd married Anne of Bohemia back in 1382. She was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. The marriage was supposed to bring a military alliance. It didn't. Charles offered little help. But something else came from the marriage, something Richard didn't expect: love. Richard and Anne had no children, but they cared for each other deeply. Anne was kind. She was gentle. She advised Richard. She calmed him when he was angry. She reminded him to be merciful. With Anne by his side, Richard became a patron of the arts. He supported writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, who was writing the Canterbury Tales. He commissioned beautiful paintings like the Wilton Diptych, which still hangs in the National Gallery in London today. It shows Richard kneeling before the Virgin Mary, surrounded by saints. Richard loved beauty. He loved culture. He loved peace. For a few years, it seemed like everything might be okay. In 1394, Richard did something no English king had done in almost 200 years. He went to Ireland. England controlled parts of Ireland, but the conquest was incomplete. Irish lords ruled most of the country. Richard wanted to change that. He landed near Waterford with over 7,000 men. He campaigned through Leinster and Munster. He fought some battles, but mostly he made deals. He negotiated treaties with powerful Irish lords like the O'Neills and the O'Briens. He recognized them as English subjects if they swore loyalty to him. It was smart, it was peaceful, and it worked for a while. Richard returned to England in May 1395. He felt accomplished. He'd brought stability to Ireland. He'd brought peace to England. Things were good. But then, in June 1394, everything shattered. Anne died, suddenly, probably from the plague. Richard was devastated. He'd lost the one person who truly cared about him, the one person who didn't want anything from him except his love. Richard was so heartbroken, he ordered the destruction of Sheen Manor, the palace where Anne had died. He couldn't stand to look at it. Historians believe Anne's death changed Richard. She'd been his anchor. Without her, he drifted. He became colder, angrier, more reckless. The calm years were over.
In 1396, Richard remarried. His new wife was Isabella of Valois, a French princess. There was just one problem. Isabella was 6 years old. Even by medieval standards, this was shocking. People talked, but Richard didn't care. The marriage secured a 28-year truce with France. That's all that mattered to him. With peace secured abroad, Richard turned his attention inward. He had unfinished business. Men who had humiliated him. Men who had destroyed his friends. Men like his uncle, Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester. Richard had waited 10 years. Now it was time. In July 1397, Richard struck.
He arrested Gloucester and several other lords who had opposed him in 1387. He stripped them of their lands and titles. He threw them in prison. Some were tried, some were executed. Gloucester never made it to trial. He died in prison, murdered, most likely, on Richard's orders. Richard rewarded his own supporters with the lands and titles he'd seized. He promoted men like John Holland and Thomas Holland to dukes. He built a new faction of loyal followers. And he didn't stop there. In 1398, he called a new parliament at Shrewsbury. This parliament was packed with his supporters. They overturned the laws from the Wonderful Parliament and the Merciless Parliament. They gave Richard more power, much more. Richard started demanding new forms of address. People had to call him Your High Majesty. He wanted everyone to bow lower, to show more respect. He acted like he was untouchable, like he was divine. People started calling this period the tyranny. But Richard made a critical mistake. He thought he could rule like an absolute monarch. He thought he could ignore the nobles, control them, break them if they opposed him. He couldn't. England wasn't ready for that kind of king. The nobles were too powerful. The king needed them. He needed their money, their armies, their loyalty. Richard forgot that, or maybe he never understood it. In February 1399, John of Gaunt died. He was old. It seemed natural. But Richard saw an opportunity. He seized all of John's lands, and he exiled John's son, Henry Bolingbroke, from England. Henry had already been banished once, after a quarrel at court, but now Richard made it permanent. And he took everything that should have been Henry's inheritance. It was too much. Richard had crossed a line. Henry Bolingbroke wasn't going to accept this. Not quietly, not forever.
Summer 1399. Richard decided to go to Ireland again. No one knows exactly why. Maybe he wanted to deal with Irish lords who'd broken their promises. Maybe he wanted to crown his nephew, Thomas Holland, as King of Ireland. Whatever the reason, it was a terrible decision. Because while Richard was in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke landed in England. Henry came with a small group of men, but he didn't need a big army. English nobles were angry at Richard. They joined Henry, one by one, then in groups. Richard had taken his best supporters to Ireland with him. There was no one left in England to stop Henry. By the time Richard heard the news, it was too late. He rushed back, but Henry was already marching south toward London. Then came the final blow. Edmund, Duke of York, Richard's own uncle, the man Richard had left in charge, gathered an army to fight Henry. But when the moment came, Edmund switched sides. He joined Henry instead. Richard's cause was finished. On August 19, 1399, Richard surrendered at Flint Castle in Wales. He had no choice. No army, no allies, nothing. Henry brought him back to London. Richard was imprisoned in the Tower, the same tower where he'd hidden as a boy during the Peasants Revolt. On October 1, 1400, Richard was forced to give up his throne. 10 days later, Henry Bolingbroke was crowned King Henry IV. Everything Richard had fought for was gone. In 3 months, he'd lost it all. Richard was 32 years old, still young, still alive, and that was a problem. As long as Richard lived, he was a threat. People could rally around him. Rebellions could start in his name. In January 1400, some of Richard's old supporters tried exactly that. They plotted to kill Henry and free Richard. The plot was called the Epiphany Rising, but Henry found out before it could happen. After that, Henry made his decision. Richard had to die. Richard was moved to Pontefract Castle in the north of England, a cold, remote fortress.
No one would see him there. No one would hear him. And then, in February 1400, Richard was starved to death. No food, no mercy, just a slow, agonizing death. Day after day, his body weakened, his strength faded. The man who had once been king, who had commanded armies, married princesses, built palaces, now lay in a cell, forgotten. He died alone. His body was buried quietly at King Langley Priory. No grand funeral, no ceremony, no honors. Richard II was gone.
But the consequences of his death would echo for decades. Richard's overthrow sent a dangerous message. Kings could be removed by force. Thrones could be taken. The rules had changed. In the 1450s, England was torn apart by civil war. Two families, Lancaster and York, fought for the crown. Both were descended from Edward III. Both claimed the throne was rightfully theirs. This conflict became known as the Wars of the Roses. Many historians trace its roots back to Richard II, his tyranny, his downfall, the precedent it set. Richard had tried to be a strong king, an absolute king, but he'd been born too soon, in the wrong century, in a world where kings still needed their nobles, where power had to be shared, not seized. Had he lived 200 years later, maybe he could have been the king he wanted to be. But in the 1300s, it was impossible. And so Richard became a lesson, a warning, a tragedy. Was Richard evil? That's a hard question. He was cruel, yes. He executed men who opposed him. He grew paranoid and ruthless. But he was also a boy who never had a childhood, who wore a crown at 10, who lost everyone he loved, who learned that trust was a weakness. He was shaped by a brutal world, and in the end, that world destroyed him. Richard died alone in a dark cell, starving, with no one to hear his cries. A king reduced to nothing, a man who wanted power but found only emptiness. His story reminds us of something important. Power is fragile. Cruelty destroys even kings. And sometimes the people we become are shaped by the world that raised us. Richard II was a victim, and he was a villain. He was both, and that's what makes his story so haunting. What do you think? Was Richard a tyrant who deserved his fate? Or was he just a boy who never stood a chance? Let us know in the comments.